As far
Yeah,
as
so
your
I
training?
tweaked my yeah. So I tweaked my QL. I mean, I don't know if it was a tweak or a tear, probably somewhere between a twerk and a tear, somewhere in there. And that was like 2 months ago to the day. Actually, it was the day that Putin invaded, ironically.
It's
But
memorable.
he, I was doing strict deficit bent over rows at the end of, yeah, I know, right? Strict deficit bent over rows. Um, and I just felt something like
Yeah.
not in my lower back, but like near my lower back,
Yeah.
just like,
I've had
oh,
that.
like you're not getting that rep, like that, that one's not moving. Um, and then like I couldn't, well, I could walk, but it was like very painful. I had to keep braced. Like I couldn't walk without bracing my core,
Mm.
which in some ways was good because like it's a hell of a way to learn to brace, right? Like talk about Pavlovian, right? Like you take a step, and if you're not braced, like it'll tell you.
Zing.
And yeah, and so like even going to the bathroom, like putting on my shoes the next day, I had to like because everything tightens up, right? It's worse the day after than when it actually happens by far. And so I was like trying to loop my sock over my foot because I didn't have the range of motion to actually like bend over. And like putting on my shoes probably took 15 minutes. And but I got it done. And I was self sufficient. Um, but obviously no squats, no deadlifts. Even weird stuff would be off the table, like no incline bench pressing because it puts pressure down
Interesting.
there. I could do Larson presses. I could do no overhead pressing, no seated overhead pressing, but I could do behind the neck pressing, I guess, because there's no like
Hmm.
there's less of an arch back or less of a need to brace. Um, I could do pull-ups, but only in like an L sit position. And actually, this is when I was messing around with the rings because the gym closed because of the regulations, which was actually nice because like it kept me, with something new and something where I wasn't comparing myself to the old me. And it's been getting better slowly. I've been getting back to deadlifts, but I tweaked it the other day as well. And it's one of those things where it's like it forces you to be smarter,
Yeah.
and it really that's like the best way to learn how to be smarter, right? Because if you don't, like it tells you right away. And so this has been my sort of first major injury, I guess. It's been about 2 months, and it's mostly good days right now. Like it doesn't affect other training. It hasn't really impacted like size. But another good thing is that I've actually had to learn a bunch of different variations that I'll probably keep moving forward in some capacity. Like unilateral leg press, I would never have done that before. Like I would never even think to do it. But it's just easier in the lower back because it's you can't round your lower back with one leg, or at least it's a lot tougher to. Like B stance Romanian deadlifts, like different forms of back extensions, hamstring curls, like leg extensions, like stuff that I wouldn't normally really value very highly. But because I could do them pain free and not put stress on that area, suddenly they're viable. And then try them out, and you're like, huh, this is actually better than I thought. And like I've actually maintained my leg size pretty decently. And I think pretty much everyone who lifts hard and heavy over like the course of 10 years or so is going to have issues somewhere. It's very rare that I meet someone that's like, nope, no injuries at all. Like, and if that's you, usually they use it as marketing, right? Like Matt Wenning, that's his thing.
Yeah.
But even he, I heard him on a podcast. He's like, yeah, I've had, a few groin tweaks, a few, back tweaks or something. So I think pretty much everyone is going to have something at some time. And I think it's good just to prepare for that almost inevitability or eventuality of that happening. And if someone over the course of like 10 or 15 years of lifting had literally no issues, I'm pretty confident in saying that they're going to get suboptimal results in terms of either strength or size. Just to me, that's a sign that they're not training very hard, right? And I'm not saying you should get injured, but I'm saying like it's probably going to happen at some point if you're really pushing it. I don't know anyone who is like has a clean slate of injury.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't disagree with that. I was going to go the other way with it and say if you've lasted that long assuming that you've grown consistently, like assume that there's some upward trajectory of growth. The people that have been training that long, I'm convinced that of all the genetic predispositions we talk about, that there is a durability factor. And you see it with a lot of the guys that have meteoric rises, that like Wheels is a good example. Wheels has been dealing with some shit in the last couple of years, but he was like an all-time world record holder before that really started to catch up with him. And it's like,
it happens later. Yeah,
and
it happens after.
And I think that's also in line with, pacing your how you modify your training to accommodate your rate of progression. Because if it took a year and a half for you to go from 700 to 900, well, what changes did you make? Are you trying to handle the same amount of work at just the same percentage, and now the weight's just higher because you're stronger? Because that shit doesn't fly, and your tendons will let you know that by flying off the bone. Especially as kind of juicy as these guys tend to stay. All I can say is welcome to the club, man, because I've had a ton of back injuries, and you're absolutely right. Getting that injury is really that reframes the way you do things. So now you will be bracing, you will be taking it seriously in a way that you hadn't before. I don't think there's an easy way to frame lifting, if you want to call it entirely degenerative or entirely restorative. One of the first things I read about it when I thought, lifting just makes you Superman and you just get better at everything. That's back when I thought like being the world's strongest man also meant you could like beat anybody up, right? And then like Puchanowski proved me wrong there. Anyways, but I had really romanticized what it was. I remember seeing Fred Hatfield write that lifting is inherently degenerative, and it's like, here's one of the best lifters in the world. He's a PhD. He's written textbooks. It's like, well, he probably knows what he's talking about. But I do see this trend. There's a couple of brands that do kind of take that, what is it, the anti-fragile route, or basically the human body adapts. And it's like, it adapts, but like not, right up until it doesn't adapt. And how it adapts isn't predictable. And the whole point of requiring training variation, even starting at a linear progression with a rote novice, the reason you stop adapting is because the stress is no longer novel, and your recovery, your balance of recovery and stress shifts. So you can keep working really, really, really hard. Nothing happens. And it's like, okay, how do you predict, which structures are adapting? Like you talked about with your QL, that there's these other structures that might not recover, especially if you're transitioning to other things that maintain stress on that area. It's like, how do you predict the point at which something breaks, given all this shit you've done over the last month, over the last few years? And the QL was nasty, dude. I've had probably a dozen lower back injuries over about 10 years. And I was very stubborn with my training before I got to the root of it and fixed it. And it sidelined my training. So it was about 10 years of no real substantial progress because I was just trying to stay together with duct tape. One of my last ones was a QL strain. And it was noticeable because it was off to the side, which was not typical for most of my lower back issues that I had. That lingered around for probably 8 months. And I don't want to make you nervous, but just, and it speaks to the nature of recovery. Like, it is not linear. It's not predictable. It's not a straight line. I would have never pegged that little tweak for being something that was so insidious and chronic. Same thing with like tendinopathy. Like, it sets in and it's just, it's nasty. You can't get rid of it. So long story short, to summarize this rant, it's like, an ounce of prevention is worth $1 million in this field. If you can do little things to prevent that, you give yourself a better shot of adapting in the first place, becoming more resilient.
Yeah, Brian Bornstein, he said he had it as well. And he's like, I forget his exact wording, but he's like, it's a nasty one. Like, it's just so easy to aggravate again. And I was building up with higher reps on the deadlift, like 100 kilos, 110, 120. I did 120 for 20 reps. Just like super light, almost like cardio. I figured, like, if I'm better at reps, I might as well just do reps. And then I was like, I did 120 for 20 last week. Like, I'll see what I get for 130. It was zero. That's how many I got. It was like, it got like 3 inches up off the ground, and then it's just like, nope, like, that's not going anywhere. So, you sort of have to like reset your expectations sometimes and realize like if you feel 100%, you're probably 60%. If you feel 70%, you're probably 40 or 30%. And so like it's one of those things where yeah, you have to be really patient with it. And it does sort through who is serious about it because I could totally see most people giving up with like these types of stuff if it's back or shoulder or especially with like with the back injury, like it really messes up other areas of your life, right? Like a shoulder, like you can still walk around, right? Like
Yeah.
still functional, but lower back, yeah, man. Like,
Well, okay, like I mean, I think my most severe like injury, the one that would actually require surgical intervention, was my bicep. I had a bicep rupture doing a tire flip.
yeah,
Somebody pulled out a camera, and I'm like, this one's for Instagram, and I pulled a little too hard and it pulled up. So that's the kind of barrier to being a legit strong man, is ripping your bicep completely off the bone. Me and my wife went to Cheesecake Factory after that. You know what I mean? Like that didn't really impair my life. I did a contest 3 weeks later. I just took a bunch of BPC. But comparing that to the lower back stuff, and it gets downplayed a bit. I understand not wanting people to sit at home and do nothing. You have to get up and get moving when that happens to you. But the lower back stuff, small tweaks make day-to-day shit like impossible. So yesterday, this is how I know I'm getting old. I bent over to grab my glasses off my nightstand, and I felt that shift in my back. Like I was just a little too cold. I moved a little bit the wrong way. It was like a 6-inch range of motion. I was like, oh, fuck. And I'm like, that's all it takes for me to like be careful crossing my legs, get up a little bit slower. And the serious ones, like once you get one, you don't want it again because it genuinely makes everything harder. So like I understand not wanting to fearmonger because the trade-off of being stronger is worth it. The trade-off of the activity is worth it. There's no question about it. But at the same time, it's like there's plenty of motivation to do what you can to make sure that's not a frequent appearance in your training. Not just quality of life, but you can't train. Like you just said, you had to do a whole bunch of different exercises just to be able to get work in. You cannot train. You can't progress if you want to be competitive, even if you just do it recreationally. So I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that preventative measures, whatever the hell that means, comes in just as a catch-all. And I know there's some discussion about what that does to the narrative of training and whether it discourages people from training or not.
It's interesting because I would actually like I'd pay good money to get Jordan from Barbell Medicine and like Stuart McGill and Austin and the Squat University guy in a room. Like I would
in one room.
Not even in terms of entertainment, but also in terms of entertainment, but also just in terms of education and like they're not really at each other's throats, but they have like very different opinions on training. And it is interesting because like movement, I think you mentioned this earlier, movement can hurt, but it can also heal. And so like two people could look at the same glass of water and say half full or half empty. And you can say, oh, one is being pessimistic, one is being overly optimistic. I mean, at the end of the day, like it's just water, right? And so I think it would be really interesting just to have them like have that discussion and, try to find out like why they're looking at the same relative information, the same studies, similar populations, and, why they're coming to fairly different conclusions. And I guess I'm sort of in the middle. And this injury, like I'll admit, has sort of made me shift to one side a little bit.
Become a little more sensitive to the cause, right? Once you go through it, you're like, okay, it's not all nociception. Like it's not all that. Like it's still relevant in the recovery process because people get gun shy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that don't want to go pick up a barbell again, and there's some work that has to be done. But that's true with all physical therapy. You have my wife's mother-in-law, when she ends up in urgent care or something, if she spends a couple days in bed, she has to go through physical therapy. There's always that hesitation to be uncomfortable to restore yourself. And that's kind of universal, right? And I think, I don't know how we would set that up. I think that would be a service to the world if we made that happen and got those people together. I think the first thing you would see is that everybody would be hedging their language a little bit more than they do when they're from afar,
because
it's easy, and I don't know if you deal with this. I deal with this all the time. The voices in my head that it's like, well, nobody's in the room, so I could start barking. And you're like, well, let's pretend to be reasonable human beings and then other people are in the room. Because there's a fair amount of sensationalized language that goes around that kind of, I think, overrepresents one side. And when you get a bunch of professionals in the room, they start break it down. You're like, well, a lot of this stuff they actually practice is very similar.
We agree, yeah.
And it really comes down to, well, I think it works, but for a different reason. And in practice, as with a lot of evidence-based stuff, it doesn't really inform a different approach to the degree you might expect. But that would be incredibly interesting to see. And I interviewed Brian Carroll, and he went on about this because he's a McGill guy. And Brian's a shit stirrer. You know, Brian is cocky and he's aggressive. And before I interviewed him, he was in the comments under the post I made, intentionally talking shit to people and rallying them up, kind of intentionally as a point to like, you know, get a discussion going. But that is I don't know, it's entertaining, but that is a feature of this that controls how people react and how much emotion they bring to it. And I think that's framed the discussion quite a bit. So.
Yeah, no, it's something that's super interesting. And I think if they all were in the same chat, yeah, you'd have like maybe more hesitancy. Like Squat University, Aaron something. Something. Yeah. There we go. Yeah. He's a brilliant marketer, right? Like he'll put out stuff on Instagram that just pisses people off, right? Like a 500-pound perfect looking squat is better than a 620. And then you get a bunch of people who are just like, oh, fuck this guy, right? Like,
boom.
And then it gets like, 5,000 comments and it's way more reach and exposure. And like, I know why he's doing it, because once you're in the fitness, you're like, you know why people say what they say, or like, you know, there's a marketing aspect behind a lot of the stuff. It's like, yeah, he's saying it for a reason. And, you know, that's a big part of the reason and the way that he's built his brand. And like, you know, in a room with the barbell medicine guys, I think he'd be a lot more careful, just because like, you know, they're very well versed and very well read about the literature. And like Jordan in particular is one of the guys who I would not want to debate ever, because I've seen him like in action enough that like, you know, he can just summon up, you know, stats and data from like who knows where, and you know, so he'd be making sure that they were on point with like statistics and like the language they used. It would be super interesting though, I think, and it would be very productive. Yeah.
A lot of this discussion, I mean, and the data is relevant, you know, for as much as I've kind of gone off the rails recently as doing a lot of content taking digs at the evidence-based approach. I mean, especially obviously in medicine and recovering and how to prevent injuries or handle injuries, it's all relevant. But at the same time, and this parallels certain world events that happen where it's like, okay, we have this pool of data, but there's also a value assessment that has to be done that objectivity or science can't really tell you. You know, what is the amount of risk, given that you know the risk, what is the appropriate amount of risk that you are willing to handle? Where's the trade-off for you? And there's definitely some qualitative stuff that comes into it that, and I think there's different assumptions being made about what the appropriate trade-off is that may be a little bit more personal. So I think there's even a philosophical discussion to be had in addition to crunching all of the data. But yeah, it's I'm sure going to be a contentious topic for a while. I think all you can really do is cast a wide net, do as much as you can to keep yourself resilient, and that means doing a lot of shit you don't like to do. But how gun shy you're going to be, you know, you can't tell somebody how gun shy they should be in lifting. That's going to be a personal thing. And as a value assessment, I just don't care about people that aren't really serious lifters, and I know that's, you know, they deserve somebody's attention, you know, but that's not in my field of concern, because I know I don't think developing excess strength to a certain point is healthy. I think as far as diminished returns of what you get as far as being able to lift 10 pounds, 50 pounds more, there's a point where you're just doing this because of your ego or because, you know, we only have so many decades left and I want to do something impressive. But if you're just looking for bone density and being able to function in the real world, like, do you really need to go above a 400-pound squat? Is that is that a thing? So the diminished returns from how it makes you better versus the likelihood or the certainty of more wear over time. I mean, that's a discussion to be had. But
Yeah, I found that. I found that I'm more risk averse now than I was like my first few years of training. Just because, like, yeah, you're lifting lighter weights and you recover faster, and it's like sometimes you don't even know about like what good technique is because you haven't had an injury yet, or you haven't, had that sort of wake up call. Like I put my 2018 training up on YouTube, just like a year in review, and oh man, like there was a lot of really ugly stuff there where it's like you're squatting and it's like it's questionable in terms of like the structure of the squat, and like a lot of upper back rounding and mid and lower back, like everything is just sort of rounded. A lot of like deadlifts and bench presses and stuff like that, because you don't even really think about that necessarily, right? Like you just want more numbers, and this is how you get your numbers.